In 2015, a man named Daniel, a 33-year-old outdoorsman, decided to spend a weekend at Eagle's Crest, a remote mountain range in Montana. Daniel was no stranger to solitude. He had grown up camping, hunting, and hiking with his dad. This trip wasn't anything out of the ordinary for him. In fact, he welcomed the isolation. Eagle's Crest was notorious among the locals for its vast, uncharted wilderness. It was the kind of place where you could hike for hours without seeing another soul. And Daniel loved it for exactly that reason. The world felt so noisy, so connected, and Eagle's Crest was his chance to unplug and reset. He rented a small one-room cabin deep in the woods. It was rustic, to say the least. Just a bed, a wood stove, and a table with 2 chairs. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, and no cell service. It was perfect. The first night passed uneventfully. Daniel spent the evening reading by lantern light, occasionally jotting down notes in his journal about the peaceful sounds of the forest outside. But on the second day, something felt different. Daniel had been hiking along a ridge trail, snapping pictures of the incredible mountain views. He was about 3 miles from the cabin when he stumbled upon something odd, a weathered piece of rope tied around a tree. It wasn't just any rope. This one was frayed, old, and almost seemed out of place in such a remote area. It was tied in a peculiar way, with loops and knots Daniel didn't recognize. It wasn't a climbing rope, and it didn't look like something a camper would use. As he examined it, he noticed a faint path leading deeper into the woods, away from the main trail. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to follow it. The further he went, the quieter the forest became. Birds stopped chirping, and the crunch of his boots on the forest floor seemed unnaturally loud. After a few minutes, Daniel came across something that stopped him in his tracks. An old, rotting cabin. It was much smaller than the one he was staying in, and it looked abandoned. The windows were shattered, the roof sagging under years of neglect. But what really caught Daniel's attention was the door. It was wide open, as if someone was waiting for him to step inside. Daniel felt a pang of unease. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he couldn't shake his curiosity. He crept closer, peeking through the doorway. The cabin was empty, save for a few pieces of broken furniture and what looked like a large, metal trap hanging from the ceiling. He didn't step inside. Something about the place felt wrong. He decided to head back to his cabin and forget he ever saw it. That night, Daniel struggled to sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the window shutters. He tried to convince himself that the old cabin was just a relic from a forgotten time, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. Around midnight, he heard it. The sound of footsteps crunching through the snow outside. They were slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Daniel froze in bed, listening as the steps stopped near the window. He held his breath, waiting for the sound to move on. Then came the knock. It was a single, heavy knock on the front door. Daniel grabbed the hunting knife he kept by his bed and crept toward the window. He peeked through the curtain but saw nothing but darkness. Whoever, or whatever, had knocked was either gone or hiding just out of sight. Daniel didn't sleep that night. The next morning he decided to cut his trip short. He packed his gear and started the long hike back to his truck. But as he stepped onto the trail, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. A rope tied around a tree, just like the one he had seen near the abandoned cabin. This one wasn't here yesterday. It wasn't just a rope. It was a trail, a series of ropes tied to trees, leading into the woods. Daniel's mind raced. Was someone following him? Watching him? He thought about turning back, but then he noticed something else. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was motionless, dressed in dark clothing, and staring directly at him. Daniel bolted, He ran down the trail, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He didn't stop until he reached his truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing behind him. But the road was empty. As Daniel drove down the winding mountain road, his heart finally began to slow. He told himself it was just some hiker playing a sick joke. But as he rounded the last bend before reaching the highway, his headlights illuminated something that made him slam on the brakes. Tied to the middle of the road was another rope. Hanging from it, swaying gently in the wind, was a metal trap, the same kind he had seen in the abandoned cabin. Daniel sat frozen in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The metal trap swayed, glinting in his headlights, its sharp teeth glistening like it had just been oiled. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for him, like a warning, or worse, an invitation. He scanned the woods on either side of the road, but all he could see were trees, their branches twisting in the wind like skeletal hands. His first instinct was to ram through it, but something in his gut told him that might be a mistake. Was the trap rigged to something? Was this a setup? The road wasn't wide, and the sharp drop-off to the right meant he had no room to maneuver. He cursed under his breath, his heart thundering in his chest. Daniel reached into the glove compartment and grabbed his flashlight. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the truck, the cold night air biting at his skin. He kept his knife in his other hand, ready for anything. The trap hung about waist high, suspended by a thick rope that stretched across the road and into the woods on both sides. As he approached it, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that pressed against him like a weight. He shined his flashlight on the rope. It was old, fraying, but sturdy enough to hold the trap. His flashlight followed the rope into the woods, and that's when he saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them. They reflected the light like tiny mirrors scattered among the trees. At first he thought they were animals. Deer, maybe. But they didn't move. They just stared. And they weren't at the height of deer. They were taller, some nearly level with the tops of the trees. Daniel's stomach turned as he realized whatever those things were. They were massive. He stumbled backward, almost tripping over his own feet. He turned and ran back to the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it again, as if that would keep him safe. The eyes hadn't followed him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching. Daniel floored the gas pedal, ramming into the trap. It clanged against the hood, leaving a deep dent before clattering to the ground. The sound echoed through the forest, and for a moment, everything was still. Then came the noise. A deep, guttural growl reverberated through the trees, shaking the very ground beneath him. It was followed by the sound of snapping branches, heavy footfalls, and something moving fast. Too fast for something that big. Daniel didn't wait to find out what it was. The truck fishtailed as he sped down the road, his tires barely gripping the icy surface. He could hear it now, whatever was chasing him, crashing through the forest alongside the road. The growls grew louder, closer, until they were almost deafening. His headlights caught glimpses of massive shadows darting between the trees, impossibly fast, impossibly agile. He reached a fork in the road and veered left, the truck skidding dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. The creature, or creatures, were right behind him, their shapes looming larger and larger in his rearview mirror. He could barely make out their forms, tall, gaunt, with limbs too long for their bodies and mouths that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. The road twisted and turned, and Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened as he tried to keep control. His mind raced with questions. What were those things? Why were they after him? And what was the significance of the traps and ropes? The growls began to fade as the forest thinned out, giving way to an open expanse of rocky terrain. Daniel finally saw the highway up ahead, the glow of streetlights like a beacon of safety. He pushed the truck to its limits, the engine roaring in protest. But just as he reached the highway, something slammed into the back of the truck, sending it spinning out of control. The world blurred as the truck skidded across the icy road, finally coming to a stop in a shallow ditch. Daniel groaned, his head pounding from the impact. When he looked up, the road was empty. The growls were gone, the shadows nowhere to be seen. But he wasn't alone. A figure stood in the middle of the road, silhouetted by the headlights of an approaching car. It was tall, dressed in dark, tattered clothing, and holding something in its hand, a long, frayed rope. Daniel blinked, trying to clear the fog in his mind as he stared at the figure. The headlights from the oncoming car lit up its outline, a tall, spindly figure, impossibly thin, almost skeletal. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if it were inspecting him, curious. The car behind it screeched to a halt, the driver honking the horn. The figure didn't move. The driver yelled something from the window, but Daniel couldn't make out the words over the pounding in his ears. He fumbled with the door handle, his hand shaking uncontrollably, but he couldn't bring himself to open it. He felt like prey, frozen in the presence of a predator. The driver stepped out of the car, shouting louder now. "Hey, what the hell's going on here?" The man, middle-aged and stocky, stomped toward the figure. "Get out of the road." The figure turned its head slowly toward the man, its movements deliberate, almost mechanical. Daniel saw the man hesitate, his bravado faltering as he got a closer look. "What the?" the man muttered, his voice trailing off. Before Daniel could shout a warning, the figure moved. It was too fast. 1 second it was standing still, the next it was right in front of the man. A sickening crunch echoed through the night as the figure's elongated arm shot forward, impaling the man through the chest. Blood sprayed in an arc, painting the asphalt as the man's body went limp. Daniel let out an involuntary gasp, his hand flying to his mouth. The figure turned its head sharply toward him, its glowing, hollow eyes locking onto his. It dropped the man's body unceremoniously to the ground, then began walking toward the truck, each step slow and purposeful. Daniel scrambled to start the truck, his fingers fumbling over the keys. The engine sputtered but didn't turn over. Come on," he whispered frantically. He glanced up to see the figure only a few feet away now. Its face, or what could be called a face, was a grotesque mask of stretched skin and jagged exposed bone. The frayed rope it held in its hand dragged along the ground, leaving a faint trail of dust in its wake. The truck roared to life just as the figure reached the hood. Daniel slammed the gear into reverse, the tires spinning in the ditch before finally gaining traction. The truck lurched backward, the rear bumper scraping against the edge of the ditch. The figure leaped onto the hood, its bony fingers clawing at the windshield, leaving deep gouges in the glass. Daniel didn't think. He floored the accelerator, sending the truck careening backward onto the highway. The figure clung to the hood, its weight warping the metal. Daniel jerked the wheel, swerving violently, trying to shake it off. The figure held on, its glowing eyes never leaving his. With one last, desperate swerve, the figure finally lost its grip and tumbled off the side of the truck, rolling across the pavement. Daniel didn't wait to see if it would get back up. He spun the wheel, straightening out, and sped down the highway as fast as the truck could go. The road stretched out endlessly before him, the glow of streetlights becoming sparser until he was plunged back into darkness. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the figure was gone. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to hope that it was over. But then he saw it. The frayed rope. It was hanging from his rearview mirror, swaying gently despite the truck's speed. Daniel's blood turned to ice as he reached up to grab it, his fingers trembling. The rope felt warm to the touch, as if it were alive. A whisper filled the cab, low and guttural. "You can't run!" Daniel slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the deserted highway. The rope disintegrated in his hand, crumbling into ash. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him, seeping into his mind like a poison. He clutched his head, screaming, as the world around him twisted and warped. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer on the highway. He was back in the forest, standing in the exact spot where the trap had been. But now, the trap was gone, replaced by something far worse. Daniel's legs felt like lead as he stared at the spot where the trap had been. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the dense forest seemed to press in on him from all sides. The faint whispering he had heard in the truck was still there, but now it was louder, more distinct, as if multiple voices were murmuring just out of sight. He glanced around, heart hammering, and realized the forest wasn't the same as before. The trees were gnarled and blackened, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath his feet was slick, covered in a dark, tar-like substance that clung to his boots with every step. The air smelled of rot and sulfur, burning his nostrils. "Where am I?" he muttered, his voice shaky and raw. He turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of a way out. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of darkness and decay. The road, the truck, even the faintest sign of civilization. Gone. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Something darted between the trees, too fast to follow. Then another, and another. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, always just out of reach. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. The only response was a low, guttural laugh that seemed to echo from every direction. He stumbled forward, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. As he pushed himself up, he noticed something carved into the bark of a nearby tree. It was the symbol he had seen on the trap, a crude, spiraling design that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. He reached out to touch it, but the moment his fingers brushed the bark, a sharp pain shot through his hand. He yanked his hand back and stared in horror. The veins in his hand had turned black, the darkness spreading slowly up his arm like ink spilled on paper. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were burrowing into his mind. "No!" he gasped, clutching his arm. "No! No! No!" Something moved behind him. He spun around, and there it was. The figure. It stood just a few feet away, its grotesque form illuminated by an otherworldly glow. Its head tilted to one side, its hollow eyes boring into him. In its hand, it held the frayed rope which now writhed like a living thing. "You should never have come here," it rasped, its voice a deep, guttural growl that sent chills down his spine. Daniel staggered back, his mind racing. He needed to get out. But how? The forest was a maze, and every step seemed to lead him deeper into its twisted heart. The figure began to move toward him, slow and deliberate, the rope trailing behind it like a serpent. Panic surged through him, and he turned and ran, his boots slipping on the tar-like ground. The whispers followed him, growing louder with every step. The trees seemed to shift and twist, blocking his path, forcing him to change direction again and again. He could hear the figure behind him, its footsteps heavy and unrelenting. As he ran, he noticed something strange. The ground beneath him was changing. The tar-like substance gave way to something harder, smoother. Stone. He slowed, his breath ragged, and realized he had stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood a massive stone altar, covered in the same spiraling symbols as the trap and the tree. The air around it shimmered, as if the altar itself were vibrating with energy. The whispers fell silent. Daniel turned, his chest heaving, and saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, but its presence was oppressive, suffocating. Slowly, it raised the rope, holding it out toward him. "This is your offering," it growled. "What are you talking about?" Daniel shouted, his voice echoing in the stillness. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it gestured toward the altar. Daniel followed its gaze and saw something that made his blood run cold. On the altar was a body. Daniel froze, his breath caught in his throat as he stared at the body on the altar. It was unmistakably him. Same clothes, same features, and even the cut on his palm from the trap. His doppelganger lay lifeless, arms outstretched, the black veins from the symbol on the tree crawling across his chest and neck. It was like looking at his own corpse. "What the hell is this?" Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of the impossible scene in front of him. The figure at the edge of the clearing remained silent, the rope coiling and writhing in its hands like a living snake. "This cannot be real," Daniel muttered, taking a shaky step backward. He looked down at his hands, half expecting to see the black veins spreading further, but they were gone, his skin unblemished. His chest heaved as his mind scrambled to piece together what was happening. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied, coming from the altar now. Daniel took another step back, but the figure moved forward, blocking his retreat. Its hollow eyes bore into him, and for the first time, it spoke with a voice that seemed to reverberate from the depths of the earth. "You were chosen." "Chosen for what?" Daniel screamed, his voice cracking under the weight of fear and confusion. "What do you want from me?" The figure raised the rope higher, and the altar began to glow faintly, the spiraling symbols radiating a sickly green light. The body on the altar twitched, the black veins pulsing as if alive. Daniel's heart pounded as the whispers grew into a deafening roar, surrounding him, drowning out his thoughts. "You open the door," the figure growled. "Now, you must close it." The glowing symbols on the altar began to shift, the spirals rearranging themselves into new, jagged shapes. The body on the altar sat up suddenly, its lifeless eyes snapping open, and it turned its head toward Daniel. It opened its mouth, but instead of words, a low, guttural wail escaped, a sound that made Daniel's skin crawl. "No!" Daniel shouted, stumbling back. "This is insane!" The figure stepped closer, its skeletal hand reaching out. The rope in its grasp lashed out like a whip, wrapping around Daniel's wrist. He yelped in pain as the rope burned into his skin, the same black veins from the altar spreading up his arm once again. "You must take your place," the figure said, its voice echoing like thunder. "Balance must be restored." "I didn't ask for this!" Daniel yelled, trying to pull free, but the rope tightened, dragging him closer to the altar. The doppelganger on the altar stood now, its movements jerky and unnatural. It mirrored Daniel's appearance perfectly, down to the panic in its lifeless eyes. The whispers intensified, and Daniel felt his strength draining away as the black veins crept further up his arm. Desperate, he reached for the knife still strapped to his belt and slashed at the rope. It writhed like a snake, recoiling and releasing his wrist. Daniel stumbled back, clutching his arm, but the figure and the doppelganger advanced, their movements synchronized as if they were one. "Your life was the cost," the figure intoned. "You took what was not yours to see." "I didn't know," Daniel cried, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to help her. I didn't know." The doppelganger lunged, and Daniel instinctively raised the knife. The blade plunged into its chest, and the altar exploded with light, the spiraling symbols flashing brighter than the sun. The whispers turned into an anguished scream as the doppelganger disintegrated into ash, its form collapsing into a heap on the altar. The figure let out a guttural roar, its form flickering like static before vanishing into thin air. The clearing fell silent, the oppressive energy dissipating as the glowing altar dimmed. Daniel stood there, trembling, the knife still in his hand, staring at the ashes of what had been his duplicate. The forest began to shift, the gnarled trees straightening, the blackened bark returning to its natural brown. The tar-like substance on the ground faded, replaced by leaves and moss. The oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by the soft light of dawn filtering through the canopy. Daniel staggered back, falling to his knees. His body ached, his mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. The whispers were gone, replaced by the distant chirping of birds. He looked at his hands, expecting to see the black veins, but they were gone. His skin was clean, unmarred. He turned to look at the altar, but it too had disappeared. The clearing was empty now, just a patch of moss and wildflowers where the stone had stood. For a moment he wondered if it had all been a nightmare. But the cut on his palm, still fresh and bleeding, told him otherwise. He staggered to his feet, his legs shaky, and made his way back through the forest. The truck was there, parked where he had left it, as if nothing had happened. He climbed inside, started the engine, and drove away, without looking back. To this day, Daniel doesn't know what he unleashed in that forest, or what it meant by closing the door. But he does know one thing: he will never go back.